It's 4 in the morning, and you still haven't slept. Not because the night was cold. In the Sinai, the night is never cold enough to rest. You haven't slept because you know that when the sun rises, you'll be taken back to the mine. The turquoise mine of Serabit el-Kadim is embedded in a red sandstone cliff more than 800 meters above sea level in the middle of the Sinai. You know every crack in those walls. You know the smell of the ore when the chisel opens the stone, a mix of dry dust and scorched copper that sticks to the back of your throat. You know the sound the rock makes before it collapses, a short, low crack that you learned to hear even before you understood what it meant. You know the weight of a 40-kilogram basket of rubble on your back when you're on your knees in a 60-centimeter-high tunnel. 6 weeks here. You've lost count of the days, but not the weeks. Each week has a different smell. In the first 2, it was the smell of fear. Then came the smell of sweat baked by the sun. Now, in the 6th week, there's no smell anymore. There's only work. The man lying next to you is called Neri. He was a blacksmith in Megiddo in Canaan before the Pharaoh's soldiers arrived. He's 42 years old, an age that in the Sinai looks like 70. His hands no longer close completely. He says it's because of the cold nights. You know it's not the cold, it's the stone. The stone does that to any man's hands in 6 weeks. It does it faster to a 42-year-old man's hands. Neri looks up at the stone ceiling above them both and says something in Canaanite that you already know by heart. The same phrase every night. Tomorrow will be different. You don't answer. Not because you don't believe it. You don't answer because you know Neri doesn't need an answer. He needs the phrase. The phrase is what makes the sun rise for him. But that's not the part that matters. For you to understand how you ended up here on the stone floor of a turquoise mine in the Sinai with scarred hands and an erased name, you need to understand what Egypt was before you entered it and what Egypt did to you afterward. Because Egypt doesn't have one form of slavery, it has several. And where you enter this system determines everything. The difference between one floor and another can be the difference between a fire scar on your shoulder and a roof over your head. But all the floors have the same foundation. You no longer belong to yourself. Let's start from the beginning. You were born in Canaan, in a city that the Egyptians called an Asiatic city, because to them, everything east of the Nile Delta is Asia, and everything that is Asia is foreign. And everything that is foreign is inferior. The word they use for you, Amu, meaning Asiatic, over time became a synonym for another word, the word which means worker or servant or slave, depending on who is reading the papyrus. That ambiguity is not an accident. It's policy. You were not captured for being Asiatic. You were captured because the Pharaoh needed labor, and his army was in your region doing what armies do. The term Egyptian scribes used for men like you was sqr ankh, which in ancient Egyptian means something like struck and kept alive. It's an accurate description. You were struck, you were kept alive, and both facts serve the same function. The strike is the beginning of work. The alive is the tool. The convoy that brought you from northern Canaan to the Nile Delta had 238 men. You counted. You had to do something during the 8 days of marching to keep from losing your mind. Hands tied behind your back with strips of raw leather that cut into your skin every time you took a deep breath. Sun in your face in the morning. Sun on the back of your neck in the afternoon. Little more than a cup of water per day, enough to keep you on your feet, not enough to forget the thirst. When you entered Egypt from the east, through the border they called Jaru, you felt the first sensation you didn't expect. Egypt is green. On the other side of the Sinai, the Nile transforms the desert into something alive. Fields of wheat and barley, stretching as far as the eye can see. Mud brick villages with thatched roofs. Palm trees swaying in a wind that doesn't exist on the outside. The air smells of mud and wet vegetation, a smell you had never encountered before. And for a moment, It lasted less than a minute. You understood why the Egyptians called their land the world. Not because it's large, because it feels complete. Then the rope cut into your wrist again, and you remembered where you were. The first stop was in an open field east of Avaris, the great delta city where Asiatics had already lived for generations, some free, some not. You didn't know that yet. You only saw military tents, guards with long wooden staves, and other men like you sitting on the ground in groups separated by origin. Canaanites on one side, Nubians on the other. A group you didn't recognize, lighter skin, different hair, from the Sea Peoples. A scribe passed through each group with a papyrus and an ink palette. He didn't ask your name. He looked at you, looked at the paper, wrote something down and moved on. You found out later that what he wrote was not your name. It was your assigned function. You were becoming a line in an inventory. That is the first thing Egypt does to you. It turns you into an accounting item. The second thing Egypt does, you discovered 2 days later, when they led you to a mud brick shed where a man with a lit brazier was waiting at a stone bench. On the bench, 2 bronze objects, too small to brand cattle, the right size to brand human skin. The Pharaoh's mark, the owner's name seared into the flesh of your shoulder. Neri was ahead of you in line. You saw his expression when the bronze touched his skin. It wasn't the expression of pain. It was the expression of someone who had understood something that had been abstract and was now permanent. When it was your turn, you didn't look. You looked up at the adobe ceiling and counted the bricks. 32. You counted 32 bricks before the smell arrived. Not the pain first. The smell. Burning flesh smells like something animal. And then the pain, which is not a lightning bolt. It's a wave that keeps going. You had entered Egypt as a prisoner of war. Now you were registered state property. The difference seems small. It isn't. The inventory you belong to, after being branded, determines where you will work for the rest of the useful life Egypt calculates you have. And here, the system reveals the first thing that surprises you, because it's not simple. It's not just whip and stone. It's hierarchy, it's gradation, it's a pyramid within the pyramid. On the lowest floor are the slaves of the mines and quarries, copper in the Sinai, turquoise at Serabit el-Kadim, limestone at Tura, granite at Aswan. These are the ones Egypt spends. Labor goes in, stone comes out, ore comes out. The conversion rate doesn't interest the pharaoh. What interests him is the quantity of stone and the speed at which it arrives. You survive the mines for as long as your body holds out. Some 6 months, some 2 years. It depends on how well you were fed before arriving and how much luck you have with cave-ins. Neri lasted 4 years in the Sinai mines. You found that out in the second week when you asked how his hands had gotten that way. 4 years in the Sinai mines, and he's still standing. And the pharaoh would consider that an acceptable outcome. On the floor above the mine slaves are the slaves of the state construction works, those who make mud bricks, those who haul blocks, those who build the storage cities the pharaoh uses to store the surplus wheat he collects as tribute from all the farmers of Egypt. You'd heard of those cities, Pithom and Rameses, in the eastern delta. Asiatics have been there for generations, men who arrived like you, whose children were born in Egypt and whose grandchildren already speak Egyptian with a Delta accent. Making mud bricks seems less brutal than the mine. It's not. It's a different kind of work. The mine destroys you in the short term. Brickmaking destroys you in the long term. You start at the edge of the Nile or a canal, filling baskets with mud mixed with chopped straw, pressing the mixture into wooden molds, turning the raw bricks to dry in the sun. It looks like a potter's work. It isn't. The daily quota the foreman demands from each crew is not calculated by what is possible. It's calculated by what is needed for construction. If a wall needs 2,000 bricks a day, your team makes 2,000 bricks. If straw runs short, if the mud is too thin, if a man collapses from exhaustion, the quota is still 2,000. The Bologna Papyrus, recorded by scribes and surviving intact to our day, tells the story of two workers who fled from a foreman because he beat them. That is the only surviving documentary mention of this kind of escape. But the escape existed. What didn't exist was somewhere to go. Where did you flee from Egypt to? To the right was the Sinai. 40 days of desert between you and Canaan, without water, without food, with border guards at Charu who knew the name of every registered fugitive slave in the system. On the third floor are the domestic slaves, those whom wealthy Egyptians buy for their homes. The mansions of the Delta and of Thebes have dozens of them. The Brooklyn Papyrus, the most famous slave inventory to survive to this day, was reassembled from 600 fragments and lists 95 fugitive slaves from a private Egyptian estate. 45 of them have Semitic names. Names similar to Menahem, Asher, Shifra, names of people who came from the same place as you. The Egyptians tried to recover them. That's why the papyrus exists. Domestic life seems softer because there's a roof, because there's regular food, because you're not in the Sinai with your throat full of copper dust. But the dynamic is the same. You belong to the house. Belonging to the house means you wake up when the house wakes up, sleep when the house allows, eat what's left after the family eats, and do whatever is asked of you with no right to say no. The women who work in the mansion kitchens wake before the sun. They grind wheat on handstones, work that takes hours and wears down the knees and elbows with the repetitive motion. They make bread, ferment beer, prepare meat, feed the children of the household. Those who work in the lady of the house's personal chambers help with the bath, with the wigs, with the kohl the Egyptian women apply to their eyes every morning, with the carnelian and turquoise necklaces, the same turquoise that was pulled from the stone by people like Neri in the Sinai, now passing through their hands as ornament. There is a specific irony in that chain that you only see when you know all the floors. But the third floor has something the first and second don't. It has gaps, small, rare, but real. A domestic slave who works well could be adopted by the family. It happened. A young man named Kenher Kepesef, adopted by the scribe Ramos at Deir el Medina, inherited his adoptive father's post. His love letters and dream journals survived 3,000 years. He left the system through the top floor. A domestic slave could marry a free person. The children of that marriage could be born free. The Egyptian slavery system was not hereditary in the same way as other systems. It was not permanent by definition. It was permanent by probability. And there is a difference between those two things that seems philosophical but isn't. It is the difference between the door being locked and the key existing but being on the other side. The fourth floor is the floor of skilled slaves. Those who can read, those who know specialized crafts, those who arrived in Egypt already knowing how to do something Egypt needed. A Canaanite blacksmith is not replaceable by just any man branded on the shoulder. A Syrian weaver who knows techniques the Egyptians don't have becomes a scarce resource. A foreign physician with knowledge of herbs from northern Mesopotamia may end up serving directly under a court official. Egypt is too pragmatic to waste expertise. If you have a skill, you move up within the system. Moving up within the system is not freedom. It is managed comfort. You still belong, but you belong to someone who has an interest in keeping you functional. Neri was a blacksmith. Neri was in the Sinai. That tells you something about the system that no scribe will put on a papyrus. The system is not a meritocracy, it is an entry lottery. Where you are when the Pharaoh's army passes determines which floor you start on. And starting on the wrong floor, even with skill, can mean you don't survive long enough to reach a better one. Mine slaves who arrive with qualifications don't move up. They die with their qualifications intact. You stayed in the mines 6 weeks because a redistribution wave passed through the camp. An official from Memphis needed workers for one of the Delta construction projects. You were listed, transferred, loaded onto a boat that descended the Nile back north. It was the first time you saw the Nile up close, not from a distance with your hands tied, but on a slow wooden boat, sitting on the deck with 46 other shoulder-branded men, watching the green banks pass as the sun went down. Pithom sits on the bank of a canal in the eastern delta. You spent the next 8 months making bricks. The quota was 1,400 bricks per crew per day. Your crew had 12 men. You learned all 12 names in the first week. In the second week, you learned that you shouldn't learn the names, because men came and went, and learning the name created a weight you couldn't carry every time one of them disappeared. The foreman who supervised your crew was called Amenhotep. He was about 30, well-fed belly, tamarind staff he used more to gesture than to strike, but used it to strike when the quota fell short. It wasn't personal cruelty. It was bureaucracy. Amenhotep had his own quota. If his quota fell short, someone above him used their own staff. The system worked top-down by pressure and bottom-up by labor. You never hated Amenhotep. That was the hardest thing to understand, that the man who sometimes beat you was not your enemy. He was the gear above yours in the same machine. In the 6th month at Pithom, a scribe passed through the work area asking who knew how to do anything beyond brickmaking. You grew up helping your father, a potter. You weren't a potter yourself, but you knew kilns, you knew clay, you knew the difference between materials that withstand heat and materials that crack. You raised your hand. The scribe looked at you, wrote something down, moved on. 3 days later, you were transferred to a workshop in Memphis where ceremonial vessels were made for the Temple of Ptah. That was the floor above. The workshop was inside a temple complex. The smell of incense, not mud. A wooden ceiling, not open sky. You worked with fine clay imported from the southern delta, mixed with quartz sand, shaped into forms that followed specifications carved in stone on the workshop wall. Forms with 1,000 years of tradition, forms that the priests of Ptah, the god of craftsmen, considered sacred. You learned the forms. It took 3 months. After 6 months, the scribe responsible for the workshop said your work was acceptable. After a year, he said it was good. After 2 years, you were training the new slaves who arrived. Training, not teaching. The distinction matters. You had no authority. You had utility. And utility, in the Egyptian system, is the closest thing to stability that a HM can reach without ceasing to be a HM. Because you were still property of the Temple of Ptah, you still slept in the collective barracks behind the workshop. You still didn't choose what to eat, when to go out, who to speak to, where to go. The only thing that changed was that the probability of dying before next year had decreased considerably. In Egypt, for someone who entered through the mine floor, that is real progress. The man who slept on the mat beside yours in the Ptah workshop was called Ramu, an Egyptian, son of a free peasant who had accumulated debt with a nobleman during a bad harvest. The family didn't pay. Ramu's father put his son up as human collateral for the debt. Ramu was 15 years old when he entered the workshop. He was 31 now. Ramu was technically a debt slave, not a prisoner of war. That was a different category on the scribe's papyrus. In the daily reality, the mat was the same size, the food was the same amount, the staff made of the same tamarind, but Ramu had a document, a signed papyrus specifying the original value of his father's debt. If he accumulated that value in goods or money, the papyrus counted as proof of settlement. Egyptian law recognized that. It wasn't frequent, it was rare, but it existed. Ramu accumulated. Every month, a copper coin slipped in here, a piece of fine cloth there, trade goods he kept in a linen bundle beneath his mat. In 15 years he had gathered half the value. You watched him one night, counting the items of the bundle in the dark. He felt the gaze, turned and said, 15 years for half. Another 15 to get out, but my teeth won't give me 15 years. You didn't answer. But that night you understood the mathematics Egypt applies to all its flaws. The system doesn't need to hold you with chains, it holds you with an equation. The time needed to leave is always slightly greater than the time you have. The smell of the brand on your shoulder faded after a few months. The skin healed, became smooth and darker than the rest. You stopped being able to read what was written there, but the scribes could. Every time you were transferred or listed in an inventory, a scribe checked the mark and wrote down the name of the pharaoh who had branded you. Your personal name never appeared in the papyri. The Brooklyn Papyrus lists 95 names, but they are not the names of those people. They are the names the system used to catalog them. Some have Semitic names because Egyptian scribes, with the precision they had, recorded the phonetic origin of foreign names. But the slave listed as Shipra in the papyrus may have been called something else before Egypt. She may have had a name that her mother shouted from a distance when dinner was ready. A name that no papyrus preserved because no scribe needed it. That is the first thing Egypt erases. Before the body, before freedom, before anything else, it erases the name. 2 years into the Patar workshop, you received something you didn't expect. An assignment outside the temple walls. The priest in charge of restoring a tile panel in a private garden needed someone with skilled hands, but without status, so as not to pay like a free artisan. You were chosen. 2 days of work in the garden of a mansion in western Memphis. It was the first time in 2.5 years that you were somewhere without walls around you. The garden had an artificial lake with lotus flowers, a fig tree that gave good shade, an orange cat that watched you work for both days as if you were personally responsible for the entire situation. On the second day, in the late afternoon, before the guard came to collect you, you stood at the edge of the lake for about 2 minutes, and you thought of Neri in the Sinai, who said every night that tomorrow would be different. Neri wasn't wrong. Tomorrow was always different from today. The problem is that different didn't mean better, it only meant different. A higher floor is still inside the building. You didn't run, not because you didn't want to, because Ramu's equation was in your head. Where would you go? With what? With a name on a fugitive slave papyrus as your only identity? You went back to the temple when the guard arrived. Weeks later, a new batch of prisoners arrived from a campaign in northern Canaan. You saw them being brought through the service gate of the temple complex, hands tied behind their backs with strips of raw leather. A boy of about 18, black hair, eyes that still held that expression of someone trying to understand what had happened, looked directly at you. You saw yourself, not as a metaphor. You literally saw yourself. That same look from 2.5 years before, when you crossed the border at Charu, and the greenness of Egypt impressed you for less than a minute. You wanted to say something to him. You didn't know what. An instruction, a warning, a phrase about Neri, about Ramu, about the lotus lake in the garden of the mansion, about the difference between the floors. About the fact that the floor he lands on in the next few days will determine how long a useful life Egypt calculates he has. You said nothing, because the guard was beside him, and any sentence from you would be interpreted as interference with the state inventory. And because, honestly, there was no sentence, there was no instruction that would turn that boy into Ramu, that would take him to the workshop instead of the mine. That decision was on a papyrus in a scribe's office, a scribe who had never seen the face of either of them. The system doesn't function on personal cruelty. Personal cruelty would be simpler. You would know who to hate, how to navigate. The system functions on systemic indifference. You are an item in an inventory. The item goes where the inventory needs it. The question is not whether you can endure the mine, it is whether the number of items the mine needs has already been filled. And as long as there is war in Canaan, as long as there are campaigns in Nubia, as long as there is tribute coming due in the Delta, that number will never be filled. The 18-year-old boy passed through the gate. The guard pushed. The leather chain on his wrists disappeared into the shadow of the stone corridor. You went back to the workshop. The clay vessels were waiting. Slavery in Egypt didn't function on hatred. It functioned on necessity. And as long as the Nile flooded, as long as the wheat grew, as long as the pharaoh built, there would always be another batch arriving through the service gate. There would always be another boy looking at the green of Egypt for less than a minute before understanding where he was. There would always be someone to count the ceiling bricks. If you want to understand what happened to the people who were taken out of Egypt and crossed the desert towards something else, subscribe to the channel, because the story doesn't end here. Next video. POV: you are Moses at the moment he returns to Egypt to face the pharaoh who raised him.